Thanks very much, David. We've now got a bit of time for questions and comments, and we're going to have a mic or two that are roving to allow people to come in. So can I have an indication of who would like to speak?
David, you said that Marx's political economy...
Could you speak into the mic?
Yes, that Marx's political economy is separate from his politics. But it seems to me that the critique of political economy is born out of the critique of Proudhon as a left Ricardian, of the Chartists as inspired by left Ricardians, that Marx is talking about political economy as a form of consciousness and of modern philosophy that has expressed the self-emancipation of bourgeois society from feudalism, and that the commodity form of labor is the modality in which that emancipation has taken place, giving rise to a society based in wage labor, and that emancipation itself has become self-contradictory, has emerged into has become contradictory in a way that wasn't true for Adam Smith and the bourgeois thinkers, which is why he thinks that they're not vulgar. So that, in a sense, working through the project of bourgeois political economy is the deepest critique of politics that Marx ever wrote. That in a fundamental sense, the argument that Marx is making is saying, what would it mean to recognize with Proudhon that at the core of this society is the possibility of abolishing a form of private property that would bring into clearest and most acute recognition the fact that we own ourselves, right? That if we were all to work, then that would, if we were to abolish the capitalist class, then we would have private property in its most profound and intractable form, that is bourgeois right. This question of the relationship, it's this question of, can you really separate this? The last thing I'll say is when Engels writes to Marx after he leaves the Communist League, his critique of his comrades is he says, I'm so glad to be able to wash my hands of these goddamn comrades. Just wait till they read your political economy.
I mean, between the generality of the laws of motion of capitalism as a mode of production and the concrete singularity, there are a whole number of mediating layers of abstraction, which even in volume 1 alone, let alone volume 3, have within them a historical and social dynamic. I mean, the most obvious one is the transition from absolute surplus value to relative surplus value. So this is not only an iron law, it's the agent of history and class struggle inside the capitalist mode of production. And so I think it's actually giving Marx too little not to accept that and to try and build on it. And the big question for me is how to build on it, because did history stop when Marx died? I mean, the guy was a genius, but did he stop history? No, he didn't, right? It kept on going. And the big question is, what happened after Marx in terms of the stage of the mode of production? And it seems that level of analysis you're avoiding in your discussion. I mean, and of course there are all kinds of contradictory and ambivalent evidences in Marx from that, of course, right? But on a very particular point that you make, that there is nothing in Volume 1 to deal with the distribution of surplus value, I specifically draw attention to chapter 24, which talks about relaxing his own presuppositions, forcible reduction of wages, and access to nature. In other words, he was already opening up the transitions which were going on before him. And it's this transition from, if you like, the capitalism of Marx to the capitalism of Lenin that we have to build on.
A suggestion about how to start reading Marx for a group of students who want to study. Should they start by reading Grundrisse and then go to Capital 1, Volume 2, 3, or start reading Capital 1 and then go back to it. It's a very practical suggestion based on your experience of teaching Capital. The second is that you mentioned about universal methodological relationship, which is about relationship with nature. And there is nothing unique about relationship with nature, because every mode of production has a relationship with nature. But don't you think that, even if Marx said that each mode of production has a unique relationship with nature? If one were not recognized, then one will not be able to understand the massive scale of environmental destruction which has taken place under capitalism. Under feudalism, the scale of destruction of nature did not take place. So the particular nature of the mode of production under capitalism has to be recognized in the way it relates to nature.
I didn't say there was a gap between the political economy and politics. I said there's a gap between that and history, and that's very different. Political economy, Marx's political economy was a deeply political project, no question about it. And it was a revolutionizing of bourgeois political economy in its own terms by exposing its contradictions and its absences. And of course the big absence, and this is, if you like, the critical standpoint from which Marx works, is the sensuality of labour or the historical experience of the working class, whichever you choose. The question of, what I'm trying to draw attention to here is not necessarily Marx's own mode of thinking, but some of the tactical decisions he makes at various points of the text in Capital. At various points in the text, he will, of course, depart from that, and he does, and you can point all of these out, and I'm happy to point them out too. I can come back and cite them to you as well, without any difficulty. By the way, that does include the final kind of question, the whole kind of question in relation to nature. Occasionally Marx does, even in Capital, say something about the relation to nature, and talks about the way in which Capital will do an après-moi le déluge approach to both destroying the sources of all wealth, i.e. the labour and the natural world. So yes, there are plenty of examples where Marx actually departs from this, and in fact what makes Volume 1 so particularly engaging is he does that in a fairly freestanding kind of way. What is so annoying and irritating about Volume 2 is he does none of that. And there's hardly any kind of relief, if you like, by kind of going off. Now, I think you're, again, when you kind of say there's some movement from absolute to relative surplus value, I think that's a misreading of Marx. He points out that there's no such thing as relative surplus value without absolute surplus value, and absolute surplus value could not exist if there were not relative surplus value. The whole point of his analysis is to say at the end of the day there's just surplus value, and that is it. And it is precisely turning it into a historical sequence which is profoundly, I think a profound misreading of what Marx is doing. They are simultaneously present in any capitalistic mode of production, even though there are periods when capitalists will move to one strategy rather than to another strategy. And it is also the case that he frequently does talk about many of these mediating elements that you talk about, but what he does is to indicate that they exist. I mean, this is the typical kind of tactic. I mean, Volume 2, you get it all the time. He points to something and says, so, this is all going to look different under the credit system. It's not that he ignores the credit system. He says, but we can't deal with that further here. It is not the case, for example, in Volume 1, that he doesn't deal with the fact that you need always to produce new consumption. That you need always to actually have a dynamic process of producing new goods and all the rest of it. So it's not true to say that he didn't say anything about consumption. He does occasionally say there's something to be said about consumption, and the consumption of the working class is indeed a topic that comes in, and it comes in necessarily at certain points of the analysis only when it interferes, as he puts it in here in the Grundrisse, when it becomes clear that he cannot deal with this without actually taking up the question of working class consumption. And there is a deep contradiction in the way which comes out in Marx in Volume 1. Given the dynamics of the kind of model he's created, you see the working class being increasingly eviscerated. In the end of Volume 2, one of the big problems is where the hell's the effective demand going to come from, and part of it is going to come from working class consumption. And so one of the issues that arises at the end of Volume 2 is rational consumption on the part of the working class, which is then introduced into the whole picture as being partly what bourgeois philanthropy and bourgeois concerns are really all about. So this is a very... So yes, there are a lot of moments when these things come in. But what I would want to suggest to you is that actually when you go back and you look at that notion of universality, generality, particularity and singularity, that this is, if you like, a framework within which much of the argument of capital is constructed. And it is the bourgeois framework. And I think that this has some strengths to it, and it also has some weaknesses, and I think that when we clearly understand what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are, we will better answer the question, which is one that I think I would really like to leave with you, which is very much this question of what Marx can do for us and what we have to do for ourselves. In terms of teaching Marx, I think that it just depends where you're coming from. I mean, the idea that everybody should read the Grundrisse before they get into Marx, and then somebody will say, well, actually, you should read Hegel before you read the Grundrisse. And I'm kind of going, no, don't go in that direction, for God's sake, I mean, maybe it depends. I mean, maybe you should just read those little pamphlets on wages, price, and profit, and those kinds of things, which are actually, neat little kind of summaries of arguments, and sometimes. I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know, I don't know whether people here would agree. What I do know from the reaction I've had is that people have really, really enjoyed having the video lectures. They've been fantastic. I get fantastic emails from people. I mean, a fantastic email from some guy who was older than I am, who kind of said, I live in this little town in Oregon, there's 60,000 people, and I always wanted to read Capital, and I never could do it, and finally I've done it, and he said, it's such a fantastic experience. I wrote about it and he sent me this very excited piece he wrote in the local newspaper for 60,000 people saying, this is a fantastic time I had doing this. So how to do it, I don't know, and I think all kinds of possibilities exist out there. Some people want it this way, some people want it that way, depends on your background, I used to find in teaching it depended upon which discipline people came from. I mean, I recount in the Companion, God, I got into these people who just encountered Derrida, and we didn't get out of the first chapter for 8 weeks, and I just kind of drove me nuts, and I thought, who is this guy? Somebody should shoot him before he gets too much influence. But actually, I learned from it. I learned a lot from it. I mean, at the time, I was mad as hell, but I did learn a lot from it, I have to confess, and it was very good. So where you start depends upon the baggage you come with, people coming from practical backgrounds, and how to do it. I really don't know the answer to that. I just try to do it the best way I can. The one thing I do know, I think, which is very important, is that, we not try to make Marx more complicated than he really is. And I think that part of the problem with the academicism that has allowed Marx to survive in academia, actually, over the last 30 years, which was probably the only way it could survive over the last 30 years, that now maybe is a bit of a problem. And all of us who are involved, that's where I was, that's the way I survived, so I'm not criticizing others, I'm saying that's where we were. Maybe we're now at a conjuncture where we should really be taking on this kind of question you're raising, which is how to get people involved in this in a very profound way.
I was somewhat disheartened to hear you talk about what a prominent place capitalism is given to consumerism and the creation of consumer needs, only because I think part of our problem now is going to be capitalism putting back our consumption in quite drastic ways.
Regarding the online lectures, I'm from Malaysia. We just started the reading group in January based on your
companion lectures on Capital Volume 1. So, yeah, it's probably the first Capital Volume 1 reading group in the last 30 years, maybe in Malaysia. So, I really appreciate it. So my question is, what you have raised about what we have to think for ourselves. Since I have the opportunity to pose this question to you, when we read in the Malaysian context, the question is, we see very little outreach. There was on October 15th, there was the global call for occupying the public squares. So in Malaysia, there were probably about 100 people out in the square, or in Jakarta, also about 100 people. So there seems to be very little public outreach against this whole anger towards global capitalism. I just wondered, maybe as a theorist, what kind of specific questions you would look at the context of Southeast Asia? Why, we are still very much, the state is still very much in a neoliberal framework of development, and a lot of, the key discourse here is about debt. So maybe you could guide us with some key questions we could look at our local context. Something that you have taught us in the first chapter, where you say that the whole critique is looking at appearances and moving away through dialectics and asking deeper questions.
Thanks for this wonderful lecture, David. I just would like you to spell out the distinction you made at the beginning between history and political economy, history and theory, because I'm reminded of the passage from, I believe it's in the Grundrisse, in which Marx writes, the anatomy of the human is key to unlocking the anatomy of the ape. And I always thought this is a very profound and important methodological and epistemological assumption to deal with history and on how we understand the past. And I think that Marx applies it consistently in Capital Volume 1, when he starts discussing commodity, and only in the end we have the historical account on primitive accumulation. So I just would like you to, I always thought the entanglement between history and theory and political economy is very strong in Marx, so I would like you to spell out more the distinction that you made.
My own work has been, to a large degree, given over to overcoming that distinction between history and political economy. I mentioned the work on Second Empire Paris, which was an attempt to write a real history of what went on in that city between two revolutionary moments, and to do it in terms that were, I think, largely drawn from Marx's Capital. And I continue to try to do that kind of thing in my writing. So when I write a brief history of neoliberalism, again, there was a lot of theory at work in that. But I really wanted to write the history with a lot of theory in it. And the Enigma of Capital is a little bit the other way around, but it's a sort of going over of a general theory of crises, but with a good deal of history in it. So for me personally, I would say that I would like to see the history-theory distinction sort of become redundant. But I have to recognize that in reading Marx, it's really rather stark. I mean, you imagine that these are completely different authors when you're in the middle of Volume 2 and you go and read the 18th Brumaire. So I think there is a tradition of making that distinction, and I don't want to clarify the distinction. I want to kind of, in a way, fold it away or merge it or something of that sort, which I think does. There is, and I think this is one of the questions, previous questions. There is a dynamism in Marx's account. I mean, Marx's account is of capitalist process. It's not a thing, it's a process. What kind of process in it is it? Well, for instance, it's continuously expanding. It must necessarily expand. And if it expands, how does it expand? Where does it expand into? So actually you can indeed start to see some of the forces which are historical forces. And when I put together that sort of co-evolutionary idea in the enigma of capital, which is to say that there have to be transformations of all these elements, and you look at what neoliberalization was about, how it worked across all of those 7 moments, that it changed the nature of production processes, it changed social relations in a foundational way, and mental conceptions and relation to nature, all of those things changed. And so there is, but you can see why they had to change, and why capitalism is therefore a permanently revolutionary force. So we have those understandings of it so the understanding of capital is, and the laws of motion are precisely about the laws which guide its necessary aspects of development, as opposed to the contingent and accidental parts of that. And again, that comes back to this question of what is it that, if capital is going to survive, it has to do in order to survive. And you see it's caught in that kind of dilemma right now, what to do. Geographically, it really hasn't got that much place to go. Geographically, one of the things it's doing is engaging in a huge land grab right now. I mean, what's going on in Africa and what's going on in Latin America with actually grabbing resources is just astonishing. And this is what, and it's individual capitalists. I mean, it's very interesting. In the United States, of course, big universities have big endowments. So you watch what Harvard Endowment is doing. What's Harvard Endowment doing is buying up large tracts of land in Latin America and Africa, if you can possibly get hold of it. Because I think that actually they're beginning to believe that the only way they can survive ultimately is going to be as rentiers. Actually. And there are some US corporations now, this is why intellectual property rights are so important. They can survive off the property rights and not even ever produce anything. That this is the kind of the world that a segment of the bourgeoisie is moving towards. But in order to understand that, you've got to understand the significance of rent. And the significance of rent has been much underestimated in the history of the dynamics of capitalism. I pointed out in the Enigma a little work. It turns out that the bourgeoisie in Britain got far, far richer over land and land development than they ever got out of the factories of Manchester. And I think that the role of land rent has been, very, very much laid to one side. But in order to get to the point where we can merge the theory with the history, you have to have a real good understanding of a lot of these categories that we don't really integrate into the general account that comes from Marx, which is categories like rent. It is categories like the emergence of a financial elite of some kind that has a great deal of significance and power. So to me, what Marx did was to give us a grounding and a foundation to start to explore many of these aspects and do it in a way which is closer and closer to history. On the question of consumerism, this is again one of the paradoxes. That actually capital talks about the development of new wants, needs and desires. How does it do it? Well, one of the ways is it restructures the world in such a way that you have to want things whether you like them or not. For example, it built the American suburbs. Now, one of my arguments is that was one of the big ways in which they got out of the Great Depression. And in fact, San Francisco Reserve Bank came up with a nice little quote the other day, which I use in the piece that's just come out in the Socialist Register, and said, what capitalism does when it gets into a crisis is it gets out of it by building houses and filling them with things. And actually, that's what the US has been doing for the last 50 years or more. Actually, it's been doing it since 1945. It's been building the suburbs. And it keeps on building and building and building them. And what a surprise! This crisis is a crisis of housing. Oh, what a surprise! And nobody makes the connection. And actually, there is a big, big shift. If you look at the housing production in the United States, in the 1930s it was kind of doing this, and then in 1945 it tripled. And it went like this. And in 2008 it went back down to the 1930s level, i.e. that form of consumption. Now, that form of consumption carries with it certain necessities. Every suburban person has to own a lawnmower. Now, it's human species being dedicated to the idea that sometime or other in their lives they're going to become lawnmower owners. And yay! Out there go on Sunday and they'll go brrr, 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 and everything's going to be, you know. And in other words, yeah, I agree with you that at the moment when consumption of certain necessities is being restricted, the problem is, of course, that it's the necessities that are being restricted, not the goddamn lawnmowers. They're still out there mowing their lawns. And this, by the way, carries with it certain political subjectivities. I mean, it's not as if you have a collective lawnmower down the end of the street, you know, and you kind of figure out who's going to use it when. No, everybody has to have their own lawnmower stuck in their garage. And then you think of this, and you think of the use of resources, the use of land, and the cutting of grass, and you know, all that. And, anyway, I won't get into all of that. But the point about consumerism is that it is so much structured through the way, you know. And of course, you have to have a car, and you have to have a garage, and you have to have, you know, in the end, 3 cars, because your kids can't go anywhere in the suburbs unless when they're 18 years old, they get a car, and if you're lucky, they don't kill themselves. And you know, So yeah, consumer. This is the point. However, one of the things that was missed out. There's no theory of consumerism in Marx, and there should be, if you really want to develop the whole argument. One of the things that happened was cultural studies took up the question of consumerism big time and abandoned the political economic background. This was a tragic thing, and it kind of says, Marx, they don't understand anything because they haven't understood consumerism, which was a correct decision, a correct criticism, but you don't correct the criticism by abandoning the political economy. And in fact, that's what happens through a lot of cultural studies. So I think the consumerism question is kind of a very, very significant and foundational one, which I would want to spend some time with. And I'm forgetting, was your question? What was it? Yes, Hegel. Oh God, no! There's a good reason I forgot that. I always remember Joan Robinson saying her objection to Marx was it was like Hegel putting his nose between her and Ricardo, and there are enough books on Hegel for you to go read about the Hegel relation, and there are enough sessions in this conference on the Hegel relation. And I think it's all, very, very important, and I think, I'm sure significant. And actually, one of the questions of identity that Marx deals with in here is very important, and what a notion of a totality is. I think what Marx is doing here is trying to separate himself off from the conception of the totality in Hegel to a rather different view, which is much closer to the sort of Lefebvre's conception of an ensemble, an ecological kind of totality, which is an ensemble of relations. And you can even, if you want to sort of bring in Deleuze or something like that, an assemblage or something like that, Gramsci also used the concept of an ensemble as being the way to understand the totality, which is a non-Hegelian way of understanding a totality. It's more like an ecosystem with many kind of confusing parts, and I'd much rather use that. And I think what Marx is trying to do sometimes is to get himself away from that. I think that there's a clear way, to me anyway, in which some of the Hegelian logic gets into the way in which the argument gets represented in Capital. And I sympathise in the Grundrisse when Marx kind of turns around and kind of, after pages and pages of saying this is related to that and blah, 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 he kind of says, this is far too Hegelian, I've got to go back and start all over again. And I kind of sympathise a little with that. But I think, again, from a philosophical standpoint, it's obviously a very important relation. Many people now would also point to Spinoza. I have all these students who tell me I've got to go read Spinoza, and I kind of go, I'm too old for that, sorry. I just work with what I've got right now, and sorry, I'm not going to go off and join your reading group on Spinoza. Which, and it's very important. I mean, and of course Marx uses Aristotle a lot, and so it's, Yeah, well, that's me and Hegel. Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to this whole kind of issue, but you know, this comes back to what I can do for you and what you have to do for yourself. I think part of the skill of working with Marx is to look for points where you can see some connection between what you're reading and the abstractions that you're grappling with and the realities that go on around you. And when you learn to do that, then that can become a very, very productive way to go. I like to recount that actually, and paradoxically, I wasn't born a Marxist, and I actually turned to Marx rather late in life, comparatively. And one of the reasons was it made sense. And I was involved in this big housing study in Baltimore, and I came across some of these propositions about use value and exchange value, and I thought they were really very interesting. And I read Engels on the housing question, and Engels kind of said the bourgeoisie only has one way to solve its housing problem: it moves it around. So I started to use all of that, and I used that in a presentation one time. And first off, I was working with landlords, and they thought this distinction between use value and exchange value was astonishingly interesting. And one of them turned to me and said, "I thought you were an economist, you know." And this is really so much more interesting, all these supply and demand curves I keep having to look at. And it's a much more interesting way to go. And I thought, well, you know, I mean, if a guy who's kind of trying to deal with low-income housing in Baltimore and renting housing in the city of Baltimore can see that this makes a lot of sense, then this makes a lot of sense. And I did the same thing with I was at a conference, and there was a vice president of the Chase Manhattan Bank there, and I said, you know, the big problem with housing is the problem keeps getting moved around. And he turned to me and said, "That's a fantastic insight." I said, "Really is." I mean, you know, we've been really trying to improve this neighborhood in New York. He said, we put all this money into it, and now we find the people who were there are no longer living there. He said, it was a terrible result, and I really don't understand. But what you're saying is so correct. I thought, well, the Chase Manhattan Bank can get it. It's obviously is, really onto something. So the Chase Manhattan guy says to me, "So, hey, have you written that up? But where'd you get it from?" And I thought, well, what should I say? So in the end, I said, well, actually, I got it from Engels. And he says, "Oh, Engels." I said, "Is he at the Brookings Institution?" So I said, well, nobody should be. But so actually, I came to my Marxism actually through that, actually. I mean, I always was a socialist in a certain form, but Marx made so much more sense. And what you have to do is to find ways to make sense of this in relationship to things going on around you. And I mean, things like the distinction between use and exchange value are just very, very simple things that you can actually use around you, and I think very constructive ways.
Thanks, David. I think that's an excellent point at which to finish. So I think we should all thank David for a great lecture.